this video, I make simple drawings like this into something a little more realistic using various Photoshop techniques. No matter how insanely cool or absolutely horrifying. So to start off, I dropped the drawing and started making shapes around the parts of the robot. Once I was done with the shape, I filled it in by using grunge textures. And to get the right angle for each shape, I used the warp tool for every texture. Now I know the texture wouldn't fill the whole shape, so more often than not, I had to duplicate it. You might be thinking, why didn't you just make the texture larger by scaling it up to cover the whole shape? And that's because when an image is scaled up too much, you start to lose clarity. For some parts, you don't want to fill the shape up with a single texture layer, even though you know you won't lose resolution. The robot's foot is a good example of that. Right now, you see me using two different texture layers for his foot. That's because the two different parts I'm putting separate texture layers on are at different angles. When recreating the entire character out of shapes and textures, the angle is very important. Maybe that's the thing that separates the quality of your work compared to others. After getting the right angle of shapes of the legs, I started working on the shadows. Now, shadows can be very hard to perfect and can take a long time to make it look just right. For example, in the drawing, there's many joints on the robot. So to replicate that as good as possible, I'm going to use exposure layers to make shadows. Many times in this video, you'll see me change the height of my brush to make the shadows seem like they're getting darker the closer they are to other parts of the object. The best way to really understand how shadows work is really simple. Look at an object that's in front of you. It's maybe sitting on a table or hanging on a wall. Now get a flashlight or another light source and turn it on. Then point the light source at the object and move it. Now pay attention closely to the shadows and see how they change compared to the light source being closer or farther. Anyways, all I'm doing here is using the liquify tool on the duplicated leg. The reason I'm using this tool is to straighten the leg and make it look closer to the drawing. Also, duplicating this leg and curving it, rather than making a whole new leg, saved me a lot of time. 50% of this video is just me wrapping and clipping texture layers to the shapes I made by using the pen tool, as well as adding shadows. In the drawing, there's a horizontal line going across the robot's chest. To make this, I made two different shapes, the top half and the bottom half. This way, I had a line guiding me where to make my shadow. After that, I made these button-like things on his chest. I wanted these to be a different kind of metal, so I changed the color of them by using a hue and saturation mask, then adding shadows and highlights to make these parts seem more reflective. After that, I started making the left arm. This arm was more straight than the right one, and had a very similar look to the legs, so I knew this wouldn't take that long. I started like I did the legs. I first made the shape using the pen tool, then I filled the shape with the same textures, making sure not to scale them to lose any clarity. After that, I started adding the lighter shadows, then making the darker ones. This didn't take long because it would have been the third time repeating this process on one of the robot's limbs. Soon after finishing the right arm, I started on the left. This ended up being the more tricky part considering I had to make 3 different shape layers compared to 2 like the other parts. Also, this arm was twisted, so both the front and the back of the arm were showing. But like before, again and again, it's the same process. Shape layers, texture layers, shadow layers, repeat. The last three parts: the left hand, right hand, and the head. Like normal, I made a shape layer for the top and the side of the hand. I put some textures and shadows on it and it was done. And instead of making each individual finger, I just made one joint and duplicated it to match the hand in the drawing. Now at this point, I was getting lazy. Instead of making a whole new hand, I just copied it and put it on the other arm. Now for the last shape, the head. Now I bet you all can guess what I did for this as well. Shape layer, texture layer, and shadows. Except I made the visor a different tint like the buttons, but after that, it was just a matter of fixing some shadows and adding some moss to make them look old. And just like that, it's finished. From drawing to Photoshop, every shape, texture, and shadow. Now I think it turned out pretty good, or at least better than I originally hoped. I'd like to hear what you guys think. Is it bad, or do you think I did alright? Anyways, this last part is going to be a speed art of me making the background, and then we'll move on to the next one. Enjoy. So for this next drawing, I'm going to be remaking this in Photoshop. It's supposed to be a skull with mushrooms coming out of it, and I think it looks pretty cool. I can't wait to see how this turns out. So to start this one off, I drag the drawing into my composition and begin to trace out the shape of the skull. Once that's done, I start to cut off the eyes and the nose. Shortly after that, I add several texture layers to cover the entire skull, as well as use the warp tool to match the angle of the shape. And to blend all these textures, I use a soft brush along the edges. Now that that's all nice and blended, I give the whole texture an orange tint to give it some color. Now to give the skull some depth, I duplicate the skull, move it slightly down and erase what I don't need. Now to make the teeth, I actually got an image of a skull and just pulled the tooth off of it. Instead of doing that 11 more times, I just duplicated the tooth and warped it to match the drawing. Once the teeth were done, I started on the skull shadows. So basically, wherever the skull had shape to it, I just put shadows there until I was happy. After that, I started making stems of the mushrooms by tracing the shape around them and using the pen tool. Then I filled them in with textures. The texture I used was actually an image of a stem from a mushroom, which ended up working pretty well. Then after I was done filling in all the stems with the textures, I added some basic shadows to make them feel less flat. Now that all the 15 stems were done, I started on the actual mushroom part by getting an image from Pexels and cutting it out. After that, I warped it to match the shape in the drawing. Then I duplicated it many times to put on all the stems. Once I finished that, I gave the mushroom some color by clipping a hue and saturation mask and making it red. And then for some more detail, I made spots on them. Now I repeated this whole process to finish the last 7 mushrooms. And here it is, the final drawing Photoshop for this video. I think it turned out pretty decent. Real quick, before we go into the background, if you guys liked the video and want to see more, make sure to tell me in the comments. And if you have a drawing you want me to edit, feel free to send it to my Gmail. Anyways, that's it for now, and enjoy the rest of the video.